Hey there, guys. Sorry to interrupt the episode, but I just wanted to tell you that I got my real estate license in the state of Rhode Island. So if you need to buy, sell, or need help renting a property in the state of Rhode Island, feel free to reach out. Contact me at maxwellwillett@kw.com or call me at 401-487-4477, and I'd be more than happy to help you. Thanks, guys, and enjoy the rest of the episode.
Knowledge is Power is where you come to hear people's life experiences to learn from. So, without further ado, let's roll the intro.
Stay hungry, stay foolish.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I have a dream will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Hello and welcome back to the Knowledge is Power podcast. This is your host, Max Willett, and today I'm very excited to have another great guest on. So if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Hi, Max. Delighted to be with you and your audience. My name is Brad Thompson. My pen name is C. Bradley Thompson. And I am the executive director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism at Clemson University in South Carolina. And I also run the Lyceum Scholars Program at Clemson. And then I'm also a professor of political philosophy at Clemson in the political science department. And I live here in sunny South Carolina. And I guess I'm a scholar of the American founding and American political philosophy and intellectual history. And I'm also a proud proponent of a free society.
Amen. And I first heard about you on Dave Rubin's show, and I watched that, and I said to myself, I would really love to have a conversation with that guy. You know, the things you were talking about, interesting, educational, and informative. And I would love to explore some of those topics for my audience that you talked about on his shows, and a little bit more questions that I thought of personally. But a great starting point, I think, and this is something I love to ask every single one of my guests, is just to hear your life story, you know, how you got to the point you are in your life now, and then we can explore those other topics.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born and raised in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada. So I'm not an American. Well, I wasn't at the time, obviously an American. When I was 7 years old, I read a book called The How and Why Wonder Book of the American Revolution. And that book changed my life. And that was the moment when I realized that I was an American born in the wrong country. And that also began a kind of lifelong love affair with the United States of America. And when I was a teenager in high school, I used to borrow my dad's car on weekends and drive down, do long drives deep into the United States, go to McDonald's, buy a cap, baseball cap or something, turn around and go home. And, you know, would have spent maybe, 14 hours in the car just touring around the northern part of the United States. I went to college at Western State College in Gunnison, Colorado, did a master's at Boston College and my PhD at Brown University. All of that was in the 1980s. And I got my first university teaching job at Ashland College in North Central Ohio. I was there for 13 years. And I have been at Clemson ever since 2005. I love living in the United States, and I've since become a citizen. I became a citizen of the U.S. 3 years ago, which was one of the great highlights of my life. So that's the quick overview. I'll just add two other things. Particularly, this might be of interest to the younger members of your audience. When I was a young man certainly in high school, and for the first couple of years in college, I was not particularly that interested in ideas. I was mostly just an athlete, and played on a national championship football team. my first year of university in Canada before I went down to Colorado, and then placed third at the Canadian Olympic trials in 1980 in the long jump. So I was really just an athlete, and didn't have much interest in ideas per se. And then a funny thing happened. Within the course of a year or two, I read a couple of books, 2 or 3 books actually, that sort of changed the trajectory of my life. One of them was Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead. And I'd say the other one that had a primary influence on my life was a book called Natural Right and History by Leo Strauss. And when I read those 2 books almost back to back, that was the moment when I realized that what I really wanted to do was to spend the rest of my adult life sort of engaged in the battle of ideas. And that essentially is what I have been doing now for the last 40 years of my life. I live, eat, sleep, breathe ideas, and trying to, in my small, modest way, trying to restore the United States to its former freedoms.
Incredible. Yeah. And you've definitely done a great job, just especially educating, I think, me, making an impact and hearing the things you were talking about on other platforms and shows. And like I stated before, that's why I really wanted to talk to you. And as we can tell from your background, if you guys are watching, you've probably read more than those books that you have just stated with all those books behind you.
Yeah. The funny thing is that this is just about half of my library. The other half is upstairs. This is my home office, and I've probably got just as many books upstairs. So yeah, my whole adult life has been books. And I like to describe my job as I teach old books to young people. That's what I do, which means, I have the best job in the world. What could be better than that? Reading and teaching old books, great books, to young people, and talking about those books. And I get paid for it, which is the amazing thing. Yeah. And I live a great life every single day by just virtue of the fact that I get to do that every day, all day.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is something that is incredibly important, is learning from things that have already happened. History repeats itself. You've heard that a million times. I've heard it a million times. And it's something that I think people are forgetting, a simple statement like that. And I think that's definitely something I've taken away from your teachings, just watching you again on other platforms. So I'd love to start to get into your studies a little bit. And why don't we start off with John Adams, right? Something that is reoccurring, and I am very excited. I'm going to order your books on Amazon. I have them in my cart. I'm going to buy them, and I'm going to read them. Something that I've promised to myself is I'm going to start reading a lot more. Started reading a book by Dave Ramsey. I read Dune for the first time. I know that's way off topic, but it's a really, really great book, and got me sort of, threw me back into wanting to read again, was reading a book like that. But yeah, so let's get into sort of what was the spark that got you into wanting to study the life of John Adams?
Yeah, so I was in graduate school. I was at Brown University at the time, and kind of a funny story. I was writing a dissertation on Federalist political thought, and it was going to be a massive study. And after I had been working on it for about a year, a good friend of mine, a kind of mentor, looked at the table of contents of this massive work, and he said, no. You're going to spend the rest of your life trying to write a doctoral dissertation. You can't do that. Writing a doctoral dissertation is like getting a union card. You just have to do it, get it done, and get out. And so he looked at this table of content, and he saw that the first chapter of this big book project or dissertation project I was working on was on John Adams. And he said, that's it. That's your dissertation. You can drop the other 9 chapters and just write on a dissertation on John Adams. And so I took his advice, and I just immediately immersed myself in all of the secondary literature on John Adams. and then eventually all of the primary source literature. And what I came to realize was, it turns out John Adams, at least at the time, and this would have been in the early 1990s, John Adams was probably, in many ways, I'd say the most neglected of all of the founding fathers, right? There were hundreds and hundreds of books on George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. But at that point, there had been very, very few books on John Adams. And so, to paraphrase Mark Twain, I seen my opportunity and I took it. And so I just threw myself into John Adams. And, as I said, what was supposed to have been the first chapter of this other dissertation turned into a 600-page dissertation just on John Adams. And I just, through that process, I just came to have enormous respect for John Adams, both as an intellectual, as a revolutionary, as a politician, and most of all, as a man.
Yeah, and I would love to sort of hear your analysis on his life story, if that's okay. I'd be really interested to sort of divulge in John Adams and sort of take what happened in his life and apply it to modern society and sort of play with it along those lines. So I guess my first question to you is something that a lot of people don't realize, and I'm by no part, again, John Adams expert. But I will say I sort of got introduced to him through the HBO show. My father introduced me to it because he had read the book that the show is based on. And so can you explain, let's start in the beginning, I guess the sort of where the show starts, I think would be a good starting point, which is during the Boston Massacre. I don't know if you think that's a good starting point, but if there is a better starting point, I'm all for it. But his role in that I found incredibly interesting. So if you want to elaborate on that, I think that would be a good starting point.
Yeah. So let me just first say something about the HBO series. And I'm embarrassed to say that I haven't seen the whole thing. I think I saw, when it first came out, I saw the first 2 or 3 episodes, and this was 20 years ago. And this much I can tell you: the first 2 or 3 episodes that I saw, I thought were fabulous. And it's based on David McCullough's biography of John Adams, which came out a couple of years after my book on John Adams. And the McCullough book is excellent, and I thought the HBO series was just wonderful, or at least the parts that I saw. So on the Boston Massacre trial, so your audience will probably know that the Boston Massacre occurred in 1770 in Old Boston, and it was a confrontation between British troops and, let's just say, some tough guys, some Boston teenage boys. And one night, sort of tensions had been mounting over the course of several weeks between the so-called redcoats and these sort of local hooligans. And one night it resulted in the Americans, this increasing tension. The Americans started throwing snowballs at the British troops. And then the next thing, a shot is fired, and then several shots are fired, and and several Americans were killed and injured. And so the British soldiers, several of the British soldiers, most importantly Captain Preston, were arrested. And you can well imagine how high tensions were in Boston, and the whole town had turned, obviously, against these British soldiers. How dare they come to Boston? How dare they set up shop in Boston and oppress the citizens of Boston? And so tempers were running, and emotions were running very high. And of course, in Boston, they were entirely in favor of the Bostonians who had been killed. But these soldiers needed to be defended in court. And when no one was willing to defend these soldiers, John Adams took on the case on the grounds that no accused person in a free society should be without defense. And so he took on the case, and particularly for Captain Preston, who oversaw the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre. And through his remarkably persuasive powers, Adams was able to get Preston off from the conviction. And it was, of course, Adams lost a lot of favor in Boston at the time, and he was one of the favored. He was a leading revolutionary. So for him to defend these Boston soldiers, not Boston soldiers, but the British soldiers, was he was putting himself very much. He was risking his reputation with other Boston patriots and revolutionaries. But as with almost everything in his life, Adams put principles above partisanship. And that's a recurring theme throughout his entire life. John Adams was, if nothing else, a man of enormous moral integrity. He would not compromise his principles to gain favor, either with the Boston mob or with British imperial officials. 2 years before the Boston Massacre trial, he had been offered a plum position in Britain's admiralty courts, which would have greatly increased his salary. But again, he refused the position, which angered the British, pleased the Americans. And then 2 years later, he flips it and does just the opposite. He pleases the British and angers his co-revolutionaries. But again, the point being that Adams would not accept favors and promotion in contrast to his moral principles.
Interesting. And why do you think his story was so neglected up until you wrote about him and the show came into, fruition? Why do you think his story was so neglected?
It's a good question. I think probably for one major reason, and that is in the 20th century, beginning in probably the early 1930s, maybe as early as the 1920s, actually going up through the 60s, the founding became a kind of, it became a battleground amongst academics, scholars, in order to determine the proper intellectual legacy of the United States. And so basically what happened was American scholars, historians of the Revolutionary period, depending on their own personal politics, divided into two camps. There were the Jeffersonians and there were the Hamiltonians. The Jeffersonians tended to be more libertarian in nature, and the Hamiltonians were favored sort of by New Deal Democrats, certainly in the 1930s and 40s. And so American historians were sort of fighting 20th century battles, intellectual battles, political battles, using the founding fathers. And the two that they found most helpful in that regard were Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. And, and Hamilton, was, the other thing is Jefferson and Hamilton essentially had political parties backing them, right? So they, from the beginning, right, from the 1790s throughout certainly the 19th century, American politics continued to divide along those lines between Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians. Each camp had a sort of a legion of followers, where Adams, because of who he was throughout his entire career, Adams was not a party man. John Adams did not have followers like in the way that Jefferson and Hamilton did. both Jefferson and Hamilton had political parties backing them. John Adams did not have a political party backing him. John Adams was, he was the founding father who I think came closest to George Washington in that he was not a party man, and he acted simply and solely on the basis of principle, both moral and political principle.
Interesting. And why do you think, I know you just talked about the parties, the two-party system in the very beginning started to become an issue, which is something that we can talk about later. But what was the biggest thing holding him back? Do you think it was his moral and core beliefs from joining a party and making, I guess, his whole political career a little bit more, I guess, easier?
It was in part, but it goes back much further. So it really goes back to the period of the Revolution, and John Adams was he was, as I've said, he was a man of enormous integrity who would not compromise his principles in order to do what was right. And so if you go back to, say, the First Continental Congress, Adams was known as one of the leaders of the revolution in the Continental Congress. He was probably its most vocal spokesman. And that won him no friends. It won him some friends, but not all friends. And then when he was a diplomat in Europe during the 1780s, again, he went up against he went up against the policies of various political parties or factions back at home. So he was willing, for instance, to go up against Benjamin Franklin during the 1780s when both of them were in Europe at the time as diplomats, and Adams was just totally dedicated to the American cause, whereas Franklin was much more of a compromiser and was much more willing to play the game of diplomacy than was John Adams. Adams used what was sometimes called militia diplomacy. He was constantly just sort of going after the enemies of the United States, and he was always moving around. He never had stable support anywhere, but he would go wherever he thought he could gain something for the United States. So he was always on the move and always acting in the best interest of the United States. And that continued throughout his entire life. Now, let me mention one last thing. And this is the most controversial part of Adams's career. It was during his presidency, close to the end of his presidency. And he ultimately, in the end, signed the Alien and Sedition Act, which he was not really in favor of, or at least he was deeply skeptical about during this time. But you also have to understand that it turns out that, and it's not so much the Alien Act, it was more of the Sedition Act that caused so much controversy at the time and since then. But what most people don't realize is that the Sedition Act that Adams signed was one sort of imposed on him by a Federalist Congress. His party, which controlled Congress at the time, sort of imposed this on him. All he did was sign it. He didn't actively support it. That's one. Two, it turns out the sedition law of 1798 actually liberalized existing sedition law in the United States, and it allowed for the first time truth as a defense. The problem is that once again in Adams's career, it got caught up in the party feuds between the Federalists and the Republicans, and he got caught in the middle of it. And of course, in the 20th century, where we have much more liberalized sedition laws than we did in the 18th century, Adams was viewed by historians beginning in the 1930s as a great advocate of sedition. And of course, the liberal Democrats in Congress and around the United States from the 1930s on were trying to liberalize sedition laws so that socialists would have more freedom to speak in the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting how things from so long ago came into play in the 1930s, which, heavily impacted that. That's really interesting to hear that. And that's something I still would like to tie into, more modern times throughout our conversation here. But my next question for you, through your extensive investigation in the life of John Adams, what is the most valuable lesson or insight that you have taken from his contributions to the American political thought and practice?
Yeah, I think it can be summed up pretty quickly and simply, and that is act on principle. There was no founding father, not a single one, who I think could match John Adams's integrity. Adams would not compromise in order to gain personally. And Adams also attempted to unite theory and practice. So, Adams was one of the great leading advocates intellectually and politically of the Revolution. And he dedicated his life, his entire life, to the cause of first of the American Revolution and then of America. I mean, one of the extraordinary things that's not known about Adams is that between 1774 and 1789, he was away from his family for almost the entirety of that time. I mean, it's extraordinary. During a 10-year period from 74 to about 84, 85, he was at home for only 9 months of a 10-year period. And he had a wife and he had 4 children. I mean, it's just extraordinary, his devotion to the American cause. Now, of course, he could not have done it without the support of his remarkable wife, Abigail. I mean, how many other wives would permit their husband to be away for 10 years minus 9 months? I mean, it's extraordinary. Yeah. But Abigail was as dedicated to the American cause as was John Adams. And it's truly, I think, one of the great marriages in American history. In fact, I can think of no other marriage that is as impressive as was the Adams marriage.
Yeah, that's something else I would very much like to talk about more is Abigail Adams. That's something I think I hate to base my knowledge off of a TV show, but I think that that's something the show focused on a lot was Abigail Adams and how much she supported John Adams, and they both realized that this was something more than just their lives. They were accomplishing something, creating something that would last on for generations, in their hopes, and it has. And obviously now we sit here and talk about their accomplishments. But yeah, and something else I would like to sort of dive into is, that idea of applying things that he practiced into today's society. So, what in your view is the most crucial guiding principle that we can draw from his work and apply to modern society to help us with the a lot of issues that we have going on right now in the modern day America to help preserve, I guess, our democratic ideas and institutions? What are some ideas that he had that we can apply to today's society?
Yeah, so I would say 2 things, one of which I've already talked about, and that is the importance of developing a strong moral character. In many ways, I think we live in a culture today in which we don't practice the arts of character, of moral character. And for Adams and his generation, there could be no separation between moral character and right action, and right political principles. So, part of what I'm trying to do right now at Clemson University through the Lyceum Scholars program that we run is I'm trying to sort of educate a new generation of young men and women who will take the idea of moral character seriously. Because as the founding fathers knew, John Adams in particular, you can't have a free society made up of moral reprobates. And I think in many ways, the moral character, the moral way of life of this country has been declining precipitously over the course of the last 40 or 50 years. So the thing that I have learned probably most importantly from Adams is the necessity of each and every one of us developing and ultimately defending our moral character. Everything begins with one's own moral character. And sometimes I get so irritated and bored with young people who think they want to change the world, right? I hear this all the time from young people. I want to change the world. Oh, really? You want to change the world? You're 21 and you have the hubris to think you're going to change the world? Come on, let's get serious. Here's an idea. Why don't you start just with yourself? Before you think you can change the lives of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of other people, why don't you start with yourself first? And that's what John Adams did. John Adams, as a young man, attempted to achieve a kind of moral perfection, and he worked very hard at it during his years as a teenager, and then during his time in college and thereafter. So that's number one, I would say. But also connected with it is an idea that Adams developed in an essay that he wrote in 1765 called A Dissertation on the Canon and Feudal Law. And in that essay, Adams wrote at some length about a concept which has largely been forgotten today, and that is the spirit. He called it the spirit of liberty. And you could say that in many ways, that we live today with a spirit of moral slavishness and a spirit of political slavishness. But this American spirit of liberty is a spirit which says, I too am a man. I too can have the capacity to govern myself without government telling me how to live my life. And that the single most important thing that all of us have in our lives, which makes everything possible, is our liberty. Without liberty, we can't make our lives the best that we can make them. We can't make them what we would want them to be. And this spiritedness is deeply wrought into the moral constitution of the individual. And I think in many ways we have lost that spirit of liberty. I mean, think about the Stamp Act, right? Which was passed by the British Parliament in 1765. The Stamp Act was, it was not actually a particularly high tax. In fact, it was kind of a minimal tax. And up until that point, the Americans paid almost nothing in taxes, certainly to the British. Well, they did pay nothing in taxes to the British government. But with the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765, the Americans immediately ignited resistance and opposition to the Stamp Act. Now, if you think about it in the context of today, the Stamp Act is a pittance compared to the taxes that we pay today, and we just take it, right? Mm-hmm. If you think, right, many middle-class Americans today, pay somewhere, if you add up all the taxes that we pay, if you add up federal income tax, state income tax, local property taxes, and
Sales
all
tax.
kinds of sales taxes, right? It turns out most Americans, could be paying upwards of 50% of their income in taxes. Now, what is that? If you think about it, that means, think about it in these terms. That means from January 1st until June 30th, 100% of your earnings goes to the government. And then on July 1st to December 31st, you get to keep 100% of your earnings. So the question is, what is your moral political status between January 1st and June 30th? If you give 100% of your earnings,
Right.
it means you're a slave. That's the technical definition of a slave, right? And it means from July 1st until December 31st, you're free. And what do we do about it?
Nothing.
Exactly. we do nothing.
Yeah.
Which is why I said a few minutes ago, right, that the reigning moral political ethos of our time is a kind of spirit, not a spirit of liberty, but a spirit of slavishness. We've turned over our right to self-govern ourselves to bureaucrats in in all 50 state capitals and in Washington, D.C. So the thing that impresses me most about Adams and the revolutionary generation is their spirit of liberty. I mean, this spirit of liberty is like a tripwire. It's like a psychological tripwire. And if you just barely even touch the tripwire, it triggers a response, right? And today, there is no tripwire.
Yeah. So something that's resonated with me, I'm sure John Adams said something, close to this, was in the show again. The reason why he fights, the reason why he travels away from his family for so long, the reason why he does what he does is so that his children can study mathematics and their children can study the arts and history and things like that. And I think we've gotten to a very, very drawn out proportion of the ending of that statement. And we've grown almost fat in our issues that really, when you think about it, are useless issues, things that don't really matter, right? Things that have just started to stack up over all these years, and we've gotten spoiled, right? And that quote from the show really resonated with me because it's became true today,
Right.
but not in the way I think his mind thought of, because he didn't realize there's no other way to describe what's going on right now other than craziness. I think it's a simple word, but it's accurate. And you hit it nail on the head when you were talking about that. And it comes down to something as simple as moral belief. It's something that a lot of people are lacking today. And I just wanted to talk about that quote and how it resonated with me. But so is there something that, is that something that you have applied heavily to your life? Is those teachings from John Adams? Is that something that you have heavily benefited from?
Yeah, for sure. And and those two ideas in particular, that namely, one, the importance, indeed the necessity of moral character in one's life. So this was not John Adams' line. It's, there's a movie, a Spike Lee movie by this title, which is Do the Right Thing, right? But I think John Adams and the other founders, they understood that concept implicitly. And I think it's important for all of us today. And I've certainly in my life tried to live by that maxim, which is do the right thing. And do the right thing for selfish reasons. The fact of the matter is you get one life, and it's your life. It's not somebody else's life. And I do not recognize the right of anybody else to anything of my life. And I'm willing to defend to the death my right to my life and all the things that go with it, namely the liberty to live out my values, the freedom to achieve all the things in my life that I want to achieve, which includes a lot of other people, right? It's not just material acquisition. In fact, material acquisition are the things that are probably least important to me in my life. What's most important to me, and this goes to the Adams quotation, obviously would be my wife, my kids. I'm soon to be a grandfather, my soon to be grandchildren.
Congratulations.
And like Adams, right? I fight here now today, not simply and only for my freedom, but for the freedom of my children and of my grandchildren and those to follow, and to fight for the freedoms of the people that I love, my friends, my colleagues, those people in this country who still retain that sense of the spirit of liberty. I mean, one of the really difficult things for me, I mean, as someone who has spent his entire life since the time he was 7 years old, studying America, loving America, watching what has happened to this country over the course of just the last few years, right, has been extraordinarily, to put it diplomatically, disappointing. But what does that mean? Does that mean I crawl back into my hole? No, it means I double down and double down in order to fight for what is true, right, and good.
Where do you think it all went wrong? Do you think there was a turning point where we can point to and say, well, that's where we made the mistake?
Well, I would say there are several turning points. So in many ways, at the deepest level, it all begins in the post-Civil War period, when a tsunami of very bad ideas from Europe crashed onto American shores. Principally ideas from Germany, and more particularly the ideas of certain late 18th, 19th century German philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, Hegel, maybe most importantly, Marx. And those ideas eventually, because ideas have consequences, and those ideas came to dominate over the course, let's say from 1870 to 1930, over that 60-year period, those ideas came to dominate American higher education. And then it's had a slow trickle-down effect into America's government school system since approximately the 1930s. And politically, a major turning point was, of course, in the 1930s and the introduction of the so-called New Deal, which was just socialism light. And politically, we've been sort of drifting that way, on a steady course, really for the last 80, 90, 100 years. But that movement has I think greatly accelerated just in the last 4 or 5 years. And you see it, I think you saw it most visibly through the COVID lockdowns.
Right. What's interesting is when I was a junior in high school, I wrote an essay on FDR and how, to be honest, a lot of his the big things that were part of that deal, right, were more harmful in the long run than a lot of people realized. Zip codes really wasn't a thing until then. Like, people don't realize that. And income tax and a lot of things to help pull people out of the Great Depression. But in reality, like we've already talked about, half of your income is gone. And that's really where the starting point was, I think, and how a lot of his systems and things that he put into practice when he was president was harmful. And it was a big upset in my class because my teacher was a huge FDR fan. But I applauded him because he passed me, and he actually thought it was an interesting paper. So wasn't the best paper I think I've ever written, but it was something that I still think about to this day, and I wish I still had it. It's lost somewhere in the Google Drive of past, but I wish I printed it out and kept it. But yeah, so that's something that I find remarkably interesting, as a lot of people don't realize. That's I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's, like you said, during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, is when it really came into fruition.
Yeah, so that's the 1930s, and the New Deal is when the regulatory welfare state was institutionalized in this country, and it's just been, it's just been a slow working out of those ideas over the course, well, of the last 90 years. And we're really only just now starting to see the full fruition of those policies that go back to the 1930s, and the ideas that go back to the 1870s and 1880s, because all of those ideas were completely anathema to the principles of the founders' Enlightenment principles. And so, what I'm trying to do in both in my academic writings, and then let me give a plug to your audience for my Substack. So I write at the Redneck Intellectual on Substack, and I last year I wrote a series of about 20 essays on the government school system and calling for its abolition. And the last 8 months or so, I've been writing a new series of essays on the principles of the American founding, or what I call the laissez-faire Constitution, and how the laissez-faire Constitution, how it worked out in practice and created the greatest nation in the history of the world.
Yeah, anything you want to plug, you can plug it. I don't care. And you have several books as well, right? If you want to name those books off, that would be great. Go ahead and name the books off.
I would say the three principal books that I would mention are, first, the John Adams book, published in 1998. That is John Adams and the Spirit of Liberty. And then in 2010, I published a book titled Neoconservatism, an Obituary for an Idea. And then most recently, I published America's Revolutionary Mind, which is my principal work on the American Revolution. The subtitle of America's Revolutionary Mind is A Moral History of the American Revolution and the Declaration that defined it.
Interesting. Yes, and definitely something I need to read. So I want to backtrack back to John Adams a little bit and talk about something that really interests me. And in previous discussions, you've talked about the historical significance of July 1st, right? And not July 4th, which obviously is Independence Day. Can you elaborate on what makes that date so important?
Right. So July 1st was the day that the Continental Congress took up the issue of independence. So, it's probably true to say that through 1774 and 1775, there certainly wasn't a majority of Americans who were prepared to declare independence from Great Britain. John Adams once remarked during this period, 74, 75, and into early 1776, that a third of Americans were opposed to independence, and they would have been the Loyalists. A third were sitting on the fence, and a third were in favor of independence. And Adams, of course, along with his cousin Sam and George Washington, were some of the earliest proponents of independence. And so, but things were quickly moving to a crisis. In late 1775, King George III signs the so-called Prohibitory Act, which took the Americans out of his protection, which was, in a sense, a kind of de facto independence. And then in January of 1776, Tom Paine publishes Common Sense, which radicalized, and it was America's first bestseller, and it radicalized the American population. And now you start getting something close to a majority of Americans who are in favor of independence. And then between January and the end of June of 1776, the Americans are slowly, month after month, moving psychologically toward independence, because you have to remember these Americans they had been loyal subjects of the British Empire, and were in effect monarchists. They pledged their fealty to British kings throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. So psychologically, it was very hard for the Americans to get to the point where they could finally, break all of the, not just the political ties, but maybe more importantly, the psychological ties to the British monarchy and to British culture. By May, there's now a strong movement in the Continental Congress in favor of independence. They're starting to move toward it. It's picking up steam in June, and then finally, the day arrives, July 1st, 1776. And this was the day when the Americans and their representatives in the Continental Congress were to debate the great subject, which is, do we declare our independence, or do we continue trying to reconcile ourselves with Great Britain? The first person to spoke in defense of reconciliation, and that was John Dickinson, one of America's great revolutionaries and founding fathers. But Dickinson was not prepared to declare independence, and he spoke for several hours and gave a very well-reasoned but passionate speech in favor of reconciliation. And when Dickinson sat down, the room went quiet. There was a hush over Independence Hall. And everybody's now looking around the room, wondering who will be the man to stand up and argue for independence, knowing that the man who stands up will be the target of British hatred and will be the first person accused of treason, which means death by hanging. And everybody's looking around the room, who's going to stand up? And then eventually all the eyes fell on the one man whom they knew would stand up, because he had been arguing for independence and because they knew he was fearless and a man of extraordinary moral character and integrity. And of course, that man was John Adams. And Adams stood up and he made a passionate, lawyerly-like argument in favor of independence. And when he finally finished, it was done. He had won the day. He had convinced his colleagues that the only moral position they could take at this point was to declare independence. Thomas Jefferson referred to Adams's speech. He said that he was our Colossus on the floor. Adams was also described, because of that speech, as the Atlas of independence. And the next day, they voted, and then 2 days later, signed the Declaration of Independence.
That gave
That's
me
the
chills. That gave me chills listening to that. Patriotic, an amazing story. And definitely over the past few months, John Adams has definitely became a person of more interest to me, which is ultimately what brought me to you and hearing your talks about him. And yeah, I've had an absolutely amazing time talking to you. This has been incredible. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and talking about your life and John Adams. And yeah, thank you.
Max, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today.
Yeah, and I do have a last question before we wrap it up. And this is something that I ask every single one of my guests. And if you were to leave one piece of advice to my listeners, what would that piece of advice be?
Get right with yourself.
Great. Yes. All right.
That's it.
Yeah.
Get
Okay.
get right with yourself, which is to say, begin a course of self-examination and figure out what your moral principles are and figure out how you are going to live your life according to those moral principles. That, I think, is the single most important thing that any of us can do, is to, quote, as I said, get right with yourself. And then to quote the line I've already quoted from Spike Lee, do the right thing, right? And be fearless. Be fearless in the face of opposition. Because if you are a man or a woman of principle and of moral character, you will face opposition your whole life. But face it as a happy warrior, and don't give up your principles. Your moral principles are the single most important possession that you own. And in the same way that you wouldn't give up your wallet or your car to a thief, do not give up your moral principles.
Amazing advice. And thank you for sharing that. And I will make sure to apply that to my life. And yeah, I was looking forward to this conversation for a very long time. We had a little bit of a back and forth, but I'm so glad that we got to set it up. I've definitely learned a lot in this conversation, and I hope my listeners have too. And thank you again for coming on. And thank you all for listening to the Knowledge is Power podcast. And make sure to go check out Professor Thompson's books. Where, if you want me to link them, is there a website, or would you like me to link them to Amazon?
Link them to Amazon.
Okay.
And then I would really appreciate it if you could also link to my Substack, The Redneck Intellectual.
Absolutely. I'll put that in the description of the podcast. And yeah, this was awesome. This is one of the best conversations I think I've ever had. Thank you. I learned a lot, and I love talking about the United States of America. So USA. And
USA.
Tying back to the beginning, one of the greatest lines I think I've ever heard is, I was an American born in the wrong country. When you talked about in the beginning of the podcast. So thank you so much. And hopefully I'll get to talk to you again soon.
I'd like that, Max. Thank you.